So you're not one of these people who has written a zillion books. You've only written a few books, but they have such presence on the lists, on the bestseller list, in our awareness. It shapes conversation that people have. And the beautiful thing about them is they all have something in common. They have sort of, it's an anatomy of innovation and genius. And by the way, there are many people who one would give that title to, but this particular set are people who have connected in their own lives and in their own creativity lines of science with lines of art. Mm-hmm. And so if I can just understand from you what motivated you to make this kind of your latter-day mission in life, to explore these characters for our benefit.
Well, you do that as well. And I think one of the important things is, you know, if you're at the 92nd Street Y or Time Magazine, you meet a lot of smart people. And then you realize smart people are a dime a dozen. They don't usually amount to much. It's creative people. And so I wanted to do what is creativity and how do you achieve it? And to me, the essence of it is being able to love all disciplines, like, you know, you with science and art. And so I look at people who stand at that intersection, which obviously Ben Franklin did, but especially when I did Steve Jobs, he would always end his product presentation with that slide of the arts connecting to the sciences and say that's where creativity occurs. And then the ultimate of that, and the real symbol of that, is Vitruvian Man, which is a great work of science and a great work of art. And so I decided the capstone of these books would be the self-taught guy. I mean, you know, you talk about Einstein a lot in your latest book. I did it. We're never, maybe you will, but we're never quite going to be like Einstein. I mean, he had a processing power that was almost as if touched by lightning. Leonardo was born out of wedlock, didn't go to school, had trouble with math, but he's so observant and so curious. That's what made him a genius.
So let me reaffirm a statement you just made, that however rare a smart person might be in your life, in the world, smart people are actually not uncommon. And it takes an extra spark beyond that to shape the world and to innovate the world. Because the person who gets straight A's, they're not necessarily, and in fact, I would say most of the time are not the people who actually make the difference in this world. It's a curious, interesting fact.
They're the ones who write the biographies of the people.
So just to reiterate that, we've got, of your biographies, you've got Ben Franklin, one of my favorite characters, who's under-celebrated as a scientist historically.
Right, I mean, we think of him as a doddering old dude flying a kite in the rain.
Yeah.
Those electricity experiments, as you know, but most of the audience may not, are the most important experimental and then theoretical when it comes to the single fluid theory of electricity. He would have thought you were a Luddite or, you know, a Philistine if you didn't know science. But nowadays, as you've done with your books, people who know the arts and humanities often feel intimidated by science. And Ben Franklin was somebody who thought that was crazy. You're supposed to combine science with humanities.
And he was as famous, if not more famous, as a scientist across Europe than he was a diplomat in representation
he snatched lightning from the skies as courtesan when he goes to France. You know, they turn out on the streets to watch him make the progression as the ambassador, not because he's a famous diplomat, but because he has snatched lightning from the gods. He has discovered lightning rod.
Now, my only regret about him, no, it's not a regret, something I'm pissed off about.
Yeah.
So we've got him on our money,
Yeah.
all right? So if you didn't know he's on our currency, you just have to work harder because he's on the $100 bill.
Right.
Okay? He's on the $100 bill.
Yeah.
And you look on both sides and there is no iconography of his scientific interest.
Really?
As there would be for any other scientist that's on a bill historically throughout Europe before the euro came in. You You had scientists.
But you know the first Euro, what was on it?
Well, who was it?
Because they kept fighting, they couldn't
Yeah,
do it.
of course.
Vitruvian Man.
Oh,
was
nice.
The first Euro.
Nice, very nice. So Leonardo.
Yeah, Leonardo, you know,
Gets
is the
through.
one thing they could all agree on.
Oh, you've got
There
it. Yeah,
is.
there we go. Uh-huh.
That's not a Euro, that's actually his notebook page.
So let's get to Leonardo. So he was an outcast. Give me the list of things that
he's a total misfit.
Misfit, that's the word.
And, you know, and you remember Steve Jobs' wonderful line, here's to the misfits, the rebels, the round pegs in the square hole. Leonardo was born out of wedlock, didn't go to school, was gay, left-handed, somewhat heretical, vegetarian, and yet in Florence, he's totally embraced. And this is a lesson we have to learn, is that at that time in the 1470s in Florence with the Medici running things, it was a republic that was so tolerant of people coming from the Arab world after the fall of Constantinople, people from Africa, people from all over, people of different religious, as you know, the Reformation is starting to bubble up in a way. And so Leonardo wearing pink and purple short tunics, which good looking.
I have to process this. Everything you listed about his misfititude could have gotten him burned at the stake in some place in the world in some time throughout history.
He did get arrested for sodomy. Fortunately, among the 4 people arrested was a member of the Medici family, so boom, they get off. Things were slightly corrupt then.
If you get arrested with someone rich, right? Is that how?
I think people already know that in this audience. You're preaching to the choir. But I will say, to not get political on it, but it was a time of great tolerance, which is why you have great creativity. But sometimes you backslide. And Savonarola comes in the 1490s with the Bonfire of the Vanities, and they start burning at the stake gays and others. The good news is it lasted less than 4 years, and he was then gotten rid of. But we all know what it's like to backslide from an era of tolerance.
So, I, as an educator, and people who have kids in school, or anyone who's thought about it at all, one of the deep questions we harbor is, are you born innovative, or is it something that can be taught? Mm-hmm. Or something that we don't know how to teach, and we still need to figure it out? And so, you must have insights into that question right now.
Yeah, I do believe, and the theme of this book is mainly that you don't have to be born that way. Leonardo, by not having been sent to school and been, infused with the scholastic, medieval stuff they were teaching in schools, makes a list every week in his notebook of things he wants to learn. And he does it out of pure curiosity as a little kid in the village of Vinci, and he just teaches himself. And he'll say, find out why water swirls when it goes from a larger to a smaller channel. Why is the sky blue? He does experiments with vapor and light. He, describe the tongue of a woodpecker. Who on earth wakes up in the morning, other than you, and says, I want to know what the tongue of a woodpecker looks like? But it's pure curiosity, and then observant. He'd say, look at the wings of birds. Do they move up faster or down faster when they take off? These are all things we can teach ourselves, or at least pledge not to hammer out of our children, which is curiosity for its own sake, daydream, imagine, fantasize, and observe.
So something I've said for a while is, we spend the first years of our children's lives teaching them to walk and talk. Yeah. And then we spend the rest of their lives telling them to shut up and sit down. Mm-hmm. And so this is not commensurate with the
absolutely. It's a
promotion
nice
of
joke,
curiosity.
But it's true, which is we sometimes say, quit asking questions. Yeah. And Leonardo, to his deathbed, to his last page, you would know the classical mathematical challenge of squaring the circle.
Yeah, you can't do it, yeah.
Yeah, but as a little kid, it's because pi is a very irrational number, and Neil can explain it to you at some point. But he tries in his notebook as a young kid, and his last notebook page, he's still using right triangles, shading things, trying to square the circle, because nobody ever said, hey, quit asking questions.
So there are two elements of this that I want to make sure people recognize. There's being curious, but the combination of being curious and being observant.
Correct.
Oh my
What a
gosh,
good point.
that's where you take off. So what you're saying is his mind was nurtured. So you can't say he was just born doing this. He was simply curious and observant, and that recipe can drive, and if it's insatiable, my gosh, there is no limit to...
And we have 7,000 pages or more of his notebook pages.
Oh, I thought you were describing the length of this book.
No.
Oh, sorry.
It's actually short. It's on heavy stock paper because I want to give a plug to Simon & Schuster.
Okay.
Which was, I said, look, this is the big one, the final one. Put it on 80-pound stock, pure white, coated. We can afford it and keep it the same price.
And now the book weighs 80 pounds.
Yes,
See?
but
that's what happens when you put
but
on 80.
it means you have color throughout.
You have color imagery throughout this.
It's not one of the, and so every now and then it was like learning from Leonardo. How do you just try to make it perfect? Now, no, the book's not perfect, but even the fonts and the paper. So Simon & Schuster deserves. I have one of the editors, Stuart Roberts, is in the audience. You met him earlier, so I want to make sure they get their shout out. But going back to your observant thing, on these notebook pages, you just watch a mind dancing across nature, where he's trying to figure out, okay, how does a set of bubbles affect the swirl when something comes up? Let me observe it. He says one of his notebook entries is, go down to the moat near the castle and look at 4-winged dragonflies to see if their wings alternate or go up and down in unison. And he observes it. Now, the cool thing about it is every one of these things is something you and I can observe. So when I'm walking here, I try now to do that little pause, as if we were still in our wonder years before people beat it out of us, to say, why does the light hitting a shiny object have a glitter and a glint, but it moves differently than the shadow moves when you move your head? This is something Leonardo observed. He observed when he's dissecting the human face to do the Mona Lisa smile.
Wait,
that
the fact that that's even a thing to think to do.
He dissected 30 human faces.
I want to draw a face, so let me dissect a cadaver's face.
Every muscle.
Who thinks this?
Because he drilled down and did it partly because it was useful, he needed the smile, but then he drills down and he's like doing the spinal cord and the nervous system and everything. You don't need that to paint the Mona Lisa smile, but you do need it if you're Leonardo.
So how does he gain access to dead bodies?
There was a tolerance, as I said, both in Florence and later in Milan, where the church, which had banned autopsies and dissections, the church is not as strict then. The Pope has a son, Caesar Borgia, so you can tell they're not exactly strict the way it was. And so they start, for a period...
For those Jews in the audience...
Yeah, popes are supposed to be celibate.
Pope should be the most celibate Catholic in...
Yeah, and the Medici Pope were not. Popes were not. And so they do allow dissections both in the hospital, the Ospedale in Florence, and then in Milan. He works every night in the basement, and he does something that you would really appreciate, which is the visual display of information. He's a person who not only figures out how the heart valve works, but, here's just one. This is not a bad visual display of information, the fetus in the womb. And so he does dissections, but he also combines them with art.
So up till now, we've only really been describing what in modern times we might call a naturalist. Someone who observes nature, is curious about it. They might sketch it, but that alone doesn't make you an artist. So what came first, or did they both develop in tandem, the art in him and the science in him, and the engineer?
Right, art, science, and engineering all the brushstrokes of the beauties of nature. And at a certain point, when I'm at Windsor Castle, where some of his notebooks are, looking at the swirls he does called the deluge drawing, I said to the curator there, do you think he did that initially as a work of art or as a work of science? The same question you asked. As only a curator at Windsor Castle can do, he raised himself into his full glory of 5'4" and looked down upon me and said, I do not think that Leonardo would have made that distinction. And that's what sort of occurred to me, is that nature in all of its forms, is Vitruvian Man a work of science or work of art or work of math? Leonardo felt it was all together.
So it is our, dare I say, frailty of mind to even ask that question, presuming everything was compartmentalized, and then he physically connects them when he makes no distinction whatsoever.
Right, we silo things. We have departments in universities.
Yes.
You get in the Department of Astrophysics, and unlike Einstein, you don't also get taught music at the same time, or maybe, most people don't. And it's the people who do not silo knowledge and see the patterns across nature, that's another part of creativity.
In my field, we were one of the earliest out of the box to try to cross-pollinate not so much art and science, but one silo of science to another silo of science. So NASA in the 1990s created the Origins project, which was not, here's this science, we have funding for that science, it's Origins. So you pose the question, how was Earth formed? Well, you need the astrophysicists, the geologists, there's the biologists where life is making its footprint. And so that forced collaborations that created whole new journals of astrobiology, journals of astrogeology. And so that's an attempt to accomplish this more formally.
We really have to be more cross-disciplinary in our thinking.
Let's talk about Leonardo's sort of engineering, because this is a under-recognized element of his background. In his notebooks, there are drawings of all kinds of machines. And did they make these machines? Did somebody?
No, a lot of them are fantasy. And one of the things I discovered from the notebooks is that his early main job was as a theater and spectacle producer for the Medici. In other words, he did the mechanics, the scenery, the art, because this was a big deal, like Joseph Papp was a big deal when we were growing up, to have public spectacles. So that helicopter that that aerial screw that's very famous, I discovered it wasn't initially to transport humans, it was to bring angels down from the rafters in a performance of Danae, a play that they were putting on. But then, being Leonardo, it's like, let me blur the line between imagination and reality. Let me indulge fantasy. And so he says, well, okay, let me try to make human-powered flying machines. And so that's another secret of Leonardo, another thing we hammer out of our kids, which is indulge fantasy.
Yeah, and I don't know who has not seen that image. It's a corkscrew spinning, not so much propellers, but imagine a corkscrew made large.
Right.
And this, if it spins, you knew air would be shifted down or up depending on which way you turned it.
And he discovers a lot on aerodynamics because of it, and even discovers, that what we call Bernoulli's principle, or you call Bernoulli's principle, which is that if air is flowing over a curved side, it's moving faster, and so the air pressure is less, and it lifts. That's how the aerial screw works, and he discovers it. But it's really cool because he loves patterns across nature, and he discovers that water cannot be compressed, even though air can be. So it doesn't work for fish swimming. So he puts in his notebook, why do fish swim faster in water than birds fly in air? Because water is heavier. And he goes on to observe this principle. So these are things that normally we don't stop to notice, but he does.
Now you mentioned Bernoulli, Let me just do a quick demo here for everyone.
Okay.
So, these are my notes. I shouldn't have torn those.
That's all right.
All right.
We seem to be flying fine without notes.
So, this sheet of paper is curved over. So if I blow air across it, you'd think it would just keep pushing it down.
Right.
And then, but if you do that,
No, it flaps up because the air pressure is less.
so there's lower air pressure above and higher below. And on an airplane, this is why you can fly. One of several reasons why
And
you can
you
fly.
see that fluid dynamics and hydraulics and everything he does, including it all comes together in the Mona Lisa. The dissection of the eye to figure out optics, the lips and mouth, but also the flow of the river and how it curves and goes into her. There are people who've written about Leonardo, including the great Kenneth Clark, who wrote about him last century, who was an art critic, who said, if he hadn't wasted so much time doing geology and aerodynamics and optics, he could have painted more paintings. And I think the Mona Lisa
He could have been a great painter if he didn't.
Yeah, but the Mona Lisa answers with a smile, because just knowing the flow, the fluid dynamics, I think is so key. It starts when he's a young kid. He's working for Verrocchio. He does the
Working for?
Verrocchio, who's a...
You said it like
yeah, Pinocchio.
we all know.
Verrocchio runs a shop in Florence that makes a copper ball for the top of the dome on the Florence Cathedral, but the famous dome. But he does art, he does pageants, he does costumes, he does props. That was the cool thing about Florence, is it didn't say, you're an artist, you're a jewelry maker. Verrocchio was trained as a gold beater, a jewelry maker, and you're an engineer. They all kind of worked in these do-it-all shops. And Leonardo, among other things, besides soldering the ball that's on top of Brunelleschi's dome on the cathedral, he does the river in the baptism of Christ. He's like 12 years old, and you see the ripples doing it exactly right scientifically.
These would be eddies that come if you come around.
Yeah, the eddies, and that's when he discovers his most important scientific discovery was an anatomy one, which is the heart valve. And this is just huge. People thought that the heart valve pumped up and down because the blood would come out of the heart, push it open, and then the pressure would push it down. He has his eddies that he's learned as a kid inventing. He said, no, it would crumple if that were the case. The reason is when it goes into the aortic valve, the aorta, it's smaller, so it forms the eddy, and the eddy spreads out the membrane. This is what happens when you can both do the Mona Lisa and discover how a heart valve works.
So now I'm a little worried, because how would you know what moving blood does in a heart?
He dissected many times
The person's
live pigs.
Oh, live, okay.
Because he dissects the human
See, I
heart.
was onto something there, right?
He definitely worked.
Yeah.
I mean, here's some of his spiraling drawings. But in his second round of anatomy, he realizes that he's got to, figure out the heart, but he's got to figure out the fluid in it. And so he does live pigs. Which, by the way, I mean, you're an artist, you're Leonardo da Vinci, you're wearing all these purple and pink tunics and stuff, and yet at night you're butchering live pigs to figure out how the heart works. This is when you get very, very curious. You're so, And
of course, the word for that is in biology is vivisection, where the
you
subject
can't
is alive.
see it here, but this is the heart valve discovery. It shows the turning of the fluids, moving the membrane. He describes in his mirror script how he's done. And then he even shows you how to do a glass experiment using grass seeds to prove it right.
So you can follow where the seeds go.
Right, and they only totally proved him correct about 30 years ago using iodine and magnetic resonance imaging and saying, yes, it flows that way. But
Walter, nobody can see these pictures.
I know, but
they're 100 feet. So that means they have to buy the book now. You got to
buy
the book
book, or I can put them up. But I'll show you one other sweet thing, which you can't really see. I told you he was gay, and he has a...
Yeah, so what's the best evidence? I guess he was arrested for sodomy.
No, but Salai, we have pictures. He's quite open about it. He draws pictures of Salai all the time. Salai to dinner parties, and then later in life, Melzi is his companion, but he has two very upfront companions. But on the 15th page of Heart Drawings, where he finally gets it right, he gets to the last note and he draws the heart one more time, and he's human. His mind wanders, and there's another sketch of Salai. He draws it to show the heart inside his boyfriend.
So
this tale works better than when I tried it in some other cities, by the way. I like Manhattan. People going, ooh.
Yeah.
And you're going, ah. You're Florence. I've been to places that were Rome.
So he sounds like he was a little bit ADD.
You know, he was very distracted, and he'd hop around to many things, but he was also deeply focused. I mean,
well, that's
yeah,
that's
right.
That's
but he's
there.
very compulsive in terms of squaring the circle. I mean, in the book, there's just page after page of notebooks. 230 times he's trying to do it. The proportions of man that he does for Vitruvian Man are just obsessive. He also is depressed at times, and he does his deluge drawings and tells tales about it. And he's elated, somewhat manic and whatever, very friendly. People say, was he autistic? Well, no. He had a huge number of very close friends, very personable at understanding people's gestures. But I do fear, because people always ask these questions, that if he were alive today, we would pull down that diagnostic manual or whatever and put all sorts of 3- and 4-letter OCD, ADD, ADHD on him and probably put him on a pharmaceutical regimen.
So that would get rid of his ADD and his depression and all these things.
And we'd get rid of the Mona Lisa.
And we get rid of the Mona Lisa. And interesting, if we know from this evidence, circumstantial and otherwise, that he would not have been on the autism spectrum, because most of that spectrum would not involve eye contact with another human being.
He was extraordinarily good with eye. By the way...
So with Mona Lisa...
Wait, real quick, look up there. That's a self-portrait. That's him, and the eye contact is something that's pretty intense.
And of course, if you've never done this, it's spooky. You get even just a reproduction of the Mona Lisa and just walk past it, and her eyes follow you as you go by. Yeah, just
called the Mona Lisa effect. And
it's got a Mona Lisa effect.
Yeah, and it's because the way the shadows work, he understands optics and shadows. But if
everybody get up and just walk around, and you'll see.
But I'll show you, if you don't mind, one more thing that's even more interesting scientifically.
Look, we spent at least a minute on the Mona Lisa. This is the Mona Lisa here.
Right, that's what I'm going to do here.
Okay.
Which is, besides the eyes, which I have a whole section on the book of why they move, he had dissected the lips, as I told you, right, where the human cadavers, and does every muscle and every nerve that touches the lips. So it's very scientifically accurate. But he had also dissected the human eye and figured out that in the very center of the retina, the cones and fovea see black and white detail, which is something that's true. He's got it right. But the edges of the retina see colors and shadow. So if you're looking directly at something, you see the detail. But if something's coming out of the corner of your eye, you see the shadow. So for 16 years, he paints a smile with more than 200 layers of glaze, perfect. And if you look really close at the smile, and you can see it close up in the book, the corners of the lip turn down slightly, but the shadows and colors turn up. So if you stare directly at her, she suddenly is not quite smiling. It's more mysterious. But as your eye wanders to her forehead or cheek or chin, suddenly the smile lights up because you're catching it in a different part of your retina. So it's just an example of how the science makes the smile interactive, almost as if it's a virtual reality.
So one point I'd take this moment to make, that there's some who would argue that knowing the science might subtract from someone's art, because that would make it boring or distractive. And here is the example of now appealing for a scientifically literate artist, which would have no less value to society as an artistically literate scientist. And so So to know all of this, he now has the power to capture it beneath the layers of art that sit above it, so that it's more real than anything anyone imagined.
And that's one of the arguments of my book against the Kenneth Clark thesis, which is, had he not dissected the eye, had he not done the lips, had he not studied geology and understand how rivers flow into roads, flow into our veins, and that they have the exact same curves as our veins, you would not have the Mona Lisa.
There is a painting in the Louvre. I forgot that. I wrote it down. I don't have it with me now.
You tore it up and did Bernoulli on it.
No, there's a cul-de-sac, and there are trees surrounding the cul-de-sac, and there's a sun in the sky, and all the shadows of the trees all point into the center of the cul-de-sac. I'm thinking, no! This is not what shadows do.
Correct.
And so these are people who just were not observant about what they were painting. And then I hear people who are sort of apologists for them saying, oh, he probably did that on purpose. Okay, so every missing fact of nature that you didn't get right in your painting, somehow they did that on purpose? I'm not buying it.
Okay, let me go to Salvador Mundi on that point, if I may. Some of you may know of Salvador Mundi. It's on display at Christie's. It's going to be sold November 15th, the only one in private hands. There's a whole lot of science here, the way our eyes see
Wait, let's just back up. So this is a painting confirmed to have been...
Confirmed only in the past 10, 12 years to have been an authentic Leonardo. We knew it existed. It disappeared in the 1700s because some stupid British royal sold it to some ne'er-do-well nephew, and we lost track of it. It was rediscovered and authenticated as a Leonardo. It is now going on auction at Christie's with a $100 million minimum, which is very inexpensive for the only one of Leonardo's 15 finished paintings in private hands. But I'm now going to do a piece of science on you. First of all, the hand is sharp, which he doesn't usually do, sharp lines. People thought that couldn't be Leonardo. He never does sharp lines. I look in the notebooks. At the very same time he's doing this, 1502, he's doing not just distance perspective, but acuity perspective, which you would know what it is, sharpness perspective, which means at a certain focal point, lines are actually sharp, but if I'm looking at something at a little distance, it is. So it makes it look...
In photography, that'd just be the depth of field.
Correct.
So the depth of field
but
forces your plane of attention.
Right.
Simply by being in focus.
And so what he's doing there is making something look three-dimensional on a two-dimensional plane. But here's the thing you should look at, because you're a scientist. A crystal orb with the inclusions exactly right, the three inclusions perfect, crystal, but what's odd about it? It doesn't distort the robes of Jesus Christ. As you know, any lens, any object, if you take a goblet of water and you put your finger behind it, you'll see it distorted and inverted sometimes. So this gets to your question of why did Leonardo get it painted incorrectly, the way nature would not have it? And
so my answer would just be, it's Jesus.
That's the right answer. And that is the answer I come to, which is there are three possibilities. One is that he didn't know, just made a mistake. No.
You can't.
No, he's done his optics experiments. He's studied crystal. He's doing lenses because he wants to focus sunlight in order to be soldering irons and to be weapons. So we know he knows. The other is that he knows, but it would be too distracting, the way there's some fakery in the Last Supper. Like everybody's on the same side of the table. That's not the way we usually have dinner parties.
Right.
So he's
it's
doing...
leaning like this, and like
so
that.
He knows it would...
Right. You know what I'm talking about, right? Everybody in the Last Supper is like dramatically...
Why? Why dramatically? Because he's a theater producer, and he's producing it as a dramatic narrative. But to get to this, the second explanation is it's too distracting. He knows it would distort, but decides not to do it, because then you wouldn't even look at the face of Jesus. You go, boy, goodness, what's happened to the robes? The third explanation is the one you just gave, which is this is Salvador Mundi, Christ is Savior of the world. And he knows that it would distort, and he knows some of his viewers would know. But he's imparting to Salvador Mundi, as Savior of the world, the miraculous quality of nothing he touches is distorted, as the Bible tells us. and he's showing it's a miracle. And I think that's the explanation that you gave.
Yeah, given everything else we know he knows,
Yep.
and what he was curious about, there's no way that was an accident.
Correct.
That happened that way, for sure. So this is going for how much?
The minimum is 100 million.
All right, let's see.
There are people, look, there are people in this zip code for whom they've spent as much on a yacht.
Yeah.
You could buy this painting, be the only private owner of a Leonardo. You can put it on permanent display at the Met, which they would very much love. And there are people whose names I won't mention because I've talked to them, because they've called me, because I didn't know it was going to go on sale, but I have a whole part in this book because it's so much science and art connected, whose names you would know and whose zip code you live in, who are thinking of going up to at least 150 million trying to bid for this.
It's on display now as a pre-auction.
On Monday at Christie's on 51st Street, opening at 9 a.m. The public can come see it, and it's awesome.
Oh, you've already seen it, but you're not the public. That's the thing.
And I'm
Just
also
say yes to that question.
Yes, I'm not,
okay.
I am the public. And it was actually in Luke Sison, who's at the Met here. I won't get into too much detail, but was one of the people authenticated. It was in the 2011-2012 show in the National Gallery in London, where I first saw it. And that's when it was first. To be authenticated, you have to have a major show that puts you in, and that's like Good Housekeeping stamp.
Right. So before we end this and continue on with questions from the audience, could you just comment on Leonardo's capacity, either written or in practice, or his inventiveness with military machinery, catapults, this sort of thing? Just give us some reflections on that.
When he turns 30, an unnerving milestone in our lives, if we can remember it, he has messed up two paintings that he hasn't finished, Adoration of the Magi and St. Jerome, that his father, the notary, had notarized the contract. So he decides, I got to get out of here. So he moves to Milan, and he writes an amazing job application letter to the Duke of Milan. It's 11 paragraphs long. Thank God we have it in his notebook.
This is resume, basically.
Yeah, and it's his dream resume. It's slightly fantasy, like everything Leonardo does. Paragraphs are engineering. I can make weapons of war. I can make crossbows that would destroy. I can make fortresses that are impregnable. I can divert the course of rivers. They think of diverting the Arno to defeat Pisa. I can, all these engineering things. Only in paragraph 11 does he say, I can also paint. So he thinks of himself as a military engineer, and for reasons that I'll let psychologists try to figure out, I have some speculation, he really decides that's what he wants to do in his 30s for a while. Now, he makes a lot of big military drawings, tanks, crossbows, all those. With all due respect to Leonardo, and I love him as much as anybody, they were mainly fantasies. They stretched things that would not be built for another 100 or 200 years. So he was not a great military engineer. He did do one huge thing in military thing, and you've seen it a bit because of our Defense Innovation Board if you went to Fort Meade or the Defense Mapping Agency. Leonardo, in a scene that DiCaprio, who bought the rights to this, should put in the movie, is holed up in the winter of 1503 in the tiny town of Imola with Niccolo Machiavelli and Caesar Borgia. They're both working for the warlord Caesar Borgia. And Leonardo has Salai, his companion, pace off every one of the streets, 15 blocks, tiny town, and look at him, and he does it with him, and he does an aerial map, almost directly aerial view, but maybe a 5-degree skew, so you can see the three-dimensionality of it. And as Machiavelli writes in The Prince, which is about Caesar Borgia in that winter, he won not by weaponry, but by surprise. He always knew where he was, and the enemy was better than anybody else on the battlefield. So what Leonardo does by doing this notion of a map. There were no drones or blimps or balloons back then, so he has to imagine what it looks like from the air. That's actually a huge military step forward, which, as we've seen on the Defense Innovation Board, you go to the mapping agency, it looks like that Amola map.
So many things that he would do that we take for granted today, but somebody had to do them first.
Yeah,
And
it has to combine, as we started this conversation with, imagination and observation.
And just to give sort of one allow you to sort of wrap this in a bow, you can imagine, not to put words in your mouth, but I presume you can imagine he being born at a different time and a different place, and none of this would have been nurtured. So could you sort of take us out before we go to Q&A on reflecting what kind of an environment is a necessary condition for this to happen at all?
Right. The environment of creativity is such an important topic, and it's something I dwell on in this book. As I said, Florence was just the right place. Had the tolerance, had different people coming in from places. It all of a sudden had big shops that were doing everything from soldering the copper ball to drawing, painting the baptism of Christ.
So people with different ideas are coming in and not being criticized for having different ideas.
Correct.
They're being celebrated for that.
And they're sometimes not from the upper classes going to university, they're self-taught. What happens in 1452, when Leonardo and Christopher Columbus are born, and the fall of Constantinople to bring the Arab wisdom of math to Italy, is Gutenberg opens his first print shop. So we start seeing in Leonardo's notebooks, ask the astronomer so-and-so how to measure the sun, and then buy the Ptolemy translation at the stationers by the bridge. So you have a confluence of tolerance and innovation. You see that at other times. 500 years to the day almost later, you see in the Bay Area of California, huge tolerance, free speech movements, electric Kool-Aid acid test, but also 3 inventions occurring: the computer, the microchip, and the network, the internet, all come together to have another time when people can find out what they want and do what they want. So you have to sort of nurture these times of creativity, and especially in Manhattan now, where the next wave will be on health and biotech as well as big data. How will you nurture that so this city remains the cradle of creativity?
It's amazing how much time, energy, and laws we spend silencing people who are just simply different and with different views.
And when you don't, you get Florence and a Renaissance.
Yeah. Beautiful. So let's if we can bring the house lights up a bit, and we have someone up top. We didn't forget you guys up in the bleachers, and so if you have a question for Sir Walter, and while they're finding you, we'll go up front here. Did I hear you correctly that Leonardo DiCaprio bought what?
I know what I've read in the papers.
The film rights to Leonardo da Vinci's story?
Well,
okay, I didn't want to hear that right. That's all. That's all. We're
I'm
good.
hoping he'll play for it.
We're good. Front row here, sir.
Thank you.
That's all right. Well,
Yeah, I'll just speak loud. There we go. Walter, you've written some great biographies, and others like McCullough have written some good ones too. As you think about that bookshelf of great people that need to be written about, whether or not you write the next one, who needs to be on that shelf?
well, on contemporary people, I think they're very creative people whose biographies haven't been done. I think Bill Gates is one. Jeff Bezos is another. People like that. I don't think
Elon Musk.
Elon Musk. I think they're not quite ripe. When Steve Jobs first called to ask me, if I'd do his book, I kind of said, I'd done Ben Franklin, Einstein. He says, do me next. I'm going, yeah. But I said, I'll wait 30 years until you retire. And then I got told that he was keeping it secret, but he had been diagnosed. So I don't think
Diagnosed
they're ripe.
with terminal cancer.
Yeah. And so I don't think those are ripe yet. I think in history, Lorenzo the Magnificent, Lorenzo de Medici, I became fascinated by, and I don't think there's a great, if this is being tweeted out, I'll get some email from somebody who's written a biography of him, but I didn't find one. Also, there are a lot of women. I tried in The Innovators to begin and end with Ada Lovelace, Lord Byron's daughter, who combines poetry and processors to come up with the concept of a general-purpose computer. And she is the theme throughout the book, which is augmented intelligence versus artificial intelligence. I think she'd be a difficult biography because she only wrote one great scientific paper. But I think she would be a good biography.
Excellent. Another question over here.
It seems like Einstein was famous during his time, and Franklin, famous in France anyway. Was Leonardo da Vinci famous?
Very much so. First of all, he was a bit of a show person. He, as I said, wore, fancy dress and tunics and all. When he's doing the Last Supper, it becomes, and this is the 1490s, it becomes a public event. People are going to the monastery, to the dining room there where he's painting it.
It's just on the wall.
It's on the wall to watch him paint. There are huge lines when he gets back to Florence, and he's just done St. Anne, the Madonna, and Child drawing for what will become a great painting. And just to see his preparatory drawing, we're told by contemporaries there are crowds there to see it.
And I'll just supplement that by saying what might not be true always among artists is essentially always true among scientists, that if you're a great scientist, you're famous in your day. Your contributions are known in the moment, and particularly when they're applied and they change society. So, and scientists are, I would say, can be as famous in life as they are in death, whereas art, your stock value goes up after you die. Is that correct?
Right.
Yeah.
Also,
what's up with that? What?
Well,
Picasso was highly celebrated in life, of course.
Right. But there are some great geniuses, especially in the arts, that are not celebrated in their time. I think partly because science, there's just an aha breakthroughs, and then they get proven right.
Yeah.
Like there's an eclipse, as you know, that suddenly proves Einstein's general relativity is correct.
Right.
And it's the headlines in the New York Times.
Headlines.
It's like, lights, it was back when the New York Times knew how to write headlines. But you remember this headline, right? I remember reading, lights all askew in the heavens, men of science more or less agog, Einstein's theory proven correct.
Yeah.
Great
That was
headline.
a general theory of relativity demonstrated by the 1919 total solar eclipse. Eclipses are pretty common, by the way, if you didn't otherwise know that. And the theory had just been published in 1916, so it was experimentally verified within 3 years and popped.
First of all, I'll give the advice that the whole book is about and the whole theme is cross disciplines. Don't just major. People say you got to major in coding. You have to know how to code for the future. No, machines will code for us, but the creativity connected to the code is what we will do. So I would always try to do a dual major, which would be music and physics, or art and mathematics, or something like that. And I think the big problem we have in our education system is by the time somebody's 19, it's like, what are you going to major in? What are you going to specialize in? Instead of, and this is even worse in England, where I did my graduate work, you have to specialize. And I would say, for heaven's sake, do a dual major that has one of the humanities or arts and one of the hard sciences. And by the way, I will now, having preached to the choir, get a few boos by saying scientists like Neil are much more open to the beauty of art. But when I talk to people, say, oh, we need arts education, we don't need STEM, we need STEAM, I really can't stand people who don't understand the difference between Macbeth and King Lear. And then I say, yeah, you're right, we do need that. Do you know the difference between a transistor and a resistor? Do you know how a logical circuit using on-off switches does Boolean algebra? And they'll look at me and say, oh no, I don't do math, I don't do science. So we, from a humanities background, have also got to move to the intersection.
I would add there that my college program, my undergraduate degree is in physics, the PhD is in what's in astrophysics. Half of all the courses I took were not in the sciences or math. And I'd say the most influential on me was an art and design course that I took that changed how I saw the world.
Well, you know that Einstein had trouble with astrophysics, meaning after he does general relativity, he can't believe there would be black holes. He can't believe...
It interfered with his creativity.
Right. He can't believe that the universe would expand. All the things that are the astrophysical consequences of general relativity. And when he was stymied by that, he said he pulled out his violin and played Mozart because it connected him to the harmonies of the spheres.
Harmonious mundi.
We'll say of Einstein that he was much more of a theorist than a practitioner, but the question is a good one. Leonardo, for all he wanted to be thought of as an engineer who had a major impact on the diversion of rivers and all that, in the end, despite what he wanted, his huge impact is transforming art.
Yeah.
It is making on a two-dimensional plane a scene that looks three-dimensional. Doing what Neil said, which is taking a theatrical production and then making The Last Supper not just a moment, but a moment that begins as a narrative with Jesus saying, one of you shall betray me. You see it rippling out to the next set of apostles. Is it I, Lord? Is it rippling out to the end? Finally, he that dippeth his hand. You see Judas doing it. And finally, the institution of the Eucharist, you know, where he's reaching for the bread and wine. So you see him creating three-dimensionality on a plane, understanding sharp lines are not the way you do that, and understanding that even a Mona Lisa, even a still portrait can actually be a drama that changes and becomes a narrative.
Yeah, I'll add to that it's why, for example, as brilliant as Leonardo was, Isaac Newton had far more impact on civilization because the physics that he invented shaped how we actually do things physically, cities, machines, and it laid the groundwork for the Industrial Revolution. So it'd be interesting to know if Leonardo came about during the Industrial Revolution, then his sort of engineering ideas might have taken tap.
Yeah, his engineering ideas are instituted 100 or 200 years later.
Yeah.
I mean, so many of the things he sketched out, and that's the joy and the beauty of connecting fantasy with observation, is that eventually reality catches up with your imagination.
Yeah, yeah.
How do you reach the broader audience to pick the book up rather than using the Cliff Notes version, to use an old phrase, of a movie?
And just to ask, so the movie, Steve Jobs, was based on your book, just to clarify.
Yeah, and without going into too much detail, I was uncomfortable. It was loosely based on my book, but Aaron Sorkin was a screenwriter, had his own vision. And your question is a good one, which is, I don't get Hollywood. I mean, I love the fact that DiCaprio and his production company.
The other Leonardo.
Yeah, yep. But I'm not
Leonardo
involved because I just don't get Hollywood. And even though 100 times more people see a movie than buy a book, I just write the book. I'll ask you a question, Neil. Did you see the Genius series on Einstein?
Yes, I saw not all of it, but
that was based on my Einstein book. They bought the rights to it, and Ron Howard, I worked with him some on it.
And that aired on National Geographic.
Yeah, and I actually liked it.
Well, because it was a multi-part series.
Yeah.
And so now, in that medium, which now people can binge, it gives the writer, producer,
10
director.
Hours gives you.
Yeah, 10
and
hours
I think
is
they
different
did the
from 2 hours.
science well. I mean, you watched it.
Yeah.
But he's riding alongside the light beam on his bicycle. A good young actor. I can't remember his name, Johnny Flynn. And it's just a beautiful scene.
So it's an appeal to longer format television rather than the 2-hour film.
Or books.
I can't overemphasize what you don't want to be true, and that is at least 100 times, more likely 1,000 times, more people will see a movie about his book than will ever read your book. So you can grumble about it, but if it at least triggers curiosity so that they walk by your book and say, oh, is that what that's based on? And then
Well,
they
that's
pick it
why I
up.
like the Einstein thing, because I think it did expose people to it. And frankly, you do that, better than anybody since, I don't know, Carl Sagan, which is be able to draw people into science by having it, not necessarily movies, but your TV shows and stuff.
Yeah.
I think that's
Okay,
awesome.
Thank you. Yeah. Thank you. A couple more questions, and we'll get another one from up top if we've got one. Yes.
I'm somewhat surprised there was no mention of music at all. With all his interest in art, did he have any involvement with
Yeah,
music?
there's a whole chapter on music in the book and other things. When I said he went to Milan, he went as part of a cultural delegation because Florence didn't have a great army, so its influence was soft power, basically sending out its artists, its architects, its playwrights. So there's a delegation led by a playwright from the Medici with about 30 people in it, and Leonardo goes as a musician because he's invented 4 or 5 new musical instruments, one of which is called the lira da bracca, which is now like a violin, but he shaped it like a horse's head. And so he brought that with his companion. He was part of the delegation. And in there, I show his understanding of waves, which, is what you write about so often, whether it's water waves or light waves or sound waves or whatever. He understood sound waves so well that one of his great inventions that still hasn't really been produced was a keyboard instrument that made it sound through strings. In other words, like a violin. It had revolving strings, but you press, so you had the flexibility of a keyboard, but the tonal quality of strings. So there's a lot on music in the book because music is one of the sciences he loved.
Indeed. Indeed. Let's take one more question up top and one down here, and we'll call it a night. Yes?
Hi, good evening. What can be done in the education system for young children, young students, to be more creative?
Well, I do think whether it was both Einstein, who ran away from the gymnasium in Germany, which made him learn by rote, or Leonardo, it helped that they had a visual education, that they were taught...
Just to be clear, gymnasium in Germany is an educational
I think
institution.
this is one
not the gym.
auditorium that would know that
Okay, good,
better
good.
than
To be
anybody.
clear, yeah.
So what Leonardo was able to do, even when he's doing Vitruvian Man, as I said, it's sort of, well, it's not clicking now, but the circle and the square, he would see a mathematical problem and could visualize it geometrically. I think visual thinking is under-taught in our schools. Secondly, creativity coming from imagination and fantasy, as opposed to having to learn the math and the English language arts by rote, for a variety of reasons, is underdone in our school system. So allowing people to create and invent. And I guess the third thing, and it's a theme of the innovators, but also here, is collaboration, both at school level and at university, is not generally taught. In fact, we had a name for it when I was growing up. It was called cheating. But what you should be allowed to do is not do your homework, but be part of a team that does homework together. Because that's how life works. It works through collaboration.
Thank you. Our last question, sir. Yes.
So just to kind of build on the last question for children, what advice would you have for parents that want to encourage these sorts of things in their children to bring out the creativity and the observation
Yeah, I
qualities?
actually have a last chapter that's a little gimmicky, but it sort of says, here's like 20 or 30 lessons for kids and other things, or for us, is first of all, we outgrew our wonder years. You walk today and you saw the blue sky and you did not think, why is it blue? So first of all, to get our kids to think that, it would be helpful if we were more observant. If we saw a bird wing and tried to figure out how did it flap up or down faster, why is the sky blue? So having the sense of curiosity, that would help, I think, instill it in our kids. And then secondly, is nurture this sort of daydreaming and the imagination and the fantasies, because Leonardo blurred the line between fantasy and observation, but it led him to envision and be more creative than I think anybody in history.
So Walter, you'll stick around to sign your book afterwards, is that
That's
correct?
what we do at the
That's what-
92nd Street Y. So do you.
So join me in thanking Walter Isaacson. Walter.
Thank you.
You're really good.